Hello BookTube, my name is Elizabeth. Welcome or welcome back to my channel, Book as in Books. I have a tag for you today. It is the Western Canon Tag. It was created by Aaron Facer, who very kindly tagged me, and I was double tagged by Roz at Scallydandling About the Books. I'm going to leave links to both of their videos in the description box below. Description box. I managed to say it without making a mistake. It's my fifth take because I kept stumbling upon the words. Description box. Anyway, the tag, it's a very fun tag. It's a discussion tag for the most part, and I really love discussion videos. So there we go. First question. If you could choose 20 books to represent your reading of Western literature, how would you choose them? What would you look for? So in the question already, Aaron is limiting our choices by saying what you have read. And in my case, that does limit the choice. I'm not Steve Donahue. I have not read everything. I did not study literature in college. So again, I have not read everything. And there are huge holes, huge gaps in what I have read and what I haven't read. So already the choice is limited to begin with. And then I'm going to limit it furthermore. Western, what does Western mean? I think it's the first thing I needed to do to be able to choose my books is to decide what is Western. Not that I have read a whole lot of literature that is not Western, that is Eastern. I've read a bit of Japanese literature, a bit of Chinese literature, a bit of Middle Eastern literature, but really not that much. The line really was, for me, do I include Gilgamesh or not? And I decided not. I decided that it was not part of Western literature, that it would be part of Eastern literature. I decided to use the cultural notion of West, which is basically Europe and its descendant. So I potentially would include only books written in European languages, regardless of where the author is from. For example, if the author is from India and has written a book in English, I consider that book in English to be part of the Western tradition. Because I think a book written in English today, regardless of where the person is in the world, it comes at the end of a tradition that started with Beowulf, I guess, and then Chaucer, Shakespeare, Dickens, and all of that. So regardless of where you are on the planet, a book written in English comes at the end of that tradition that started in the Middle Ages. On the other hand, a book where, in a country where English is the dominant language, for example, Canada or the United States, and a book that would have been written in an indigenous language of North America, I don't think it's part of Western literature, even though Canada and the United States are considered part of the Western world, because I think culture-wise, indigenous languages have their own storytelling tradition, and it is not a Western tradition. It is not the European tradition. So it can lead to absurdities, like an author who would have written books, let's say, in Cree and in English. Their book in English would be part, in my opinion, of Western literature, but their books in Cree would not. It's a bit absurd, but I'm going to live with it, and especially that it's completely theoretical because I have not read any books in Cree or Navajo or any indigenous language. It's a huge gap, which leads us to the next question. After choosing your 20 books, what blind spots have you noticed? Oh no, I forgot a part of the first question. What would you look for? I looked for books that were representative of something, books that were influential. I wanted to have I tried to have a little something of everything that I read, of things that I thought were important. I went for representatives of something, of a literary movement, of a style, of a geography, I tried to pick a little something of everything. So the second question, after choosing your 20 books, what blind spots have you noticed? I did not choose 20 books. I chose 18 books. I started gathering my books, making a list and gathering my books, and I sort of got stuck at 18 because if I had to choose two more, I wouldn't know how to choose these two among the next 15 or 20 that in my head are part of like a second tier group. Even there's one or two that I'm not even sure or belong in the top 18. But I decided to cut it there because other books, I wasn't sure they would deserve to be there, and why these books rather than others. So instead of making a list of 30 or 50 books, I decided to leave it at 18. And the blind spots, they are numerous, and they are of three sorts, I would say. There are time period blind spots, there are geographical blind spots, and there are genre blind spots. So blind spots everywhere. So time period, I have nothing from the Middle Ages. I have read in my entire life one book written in the Middle Ages, and it was a book by Chrétien de Troyes, and I read it a long time ago. I barely remember anything of it, so I cannot really include it in my top 18, and that's it. I've read nothing else in the Middle Ages, so that's a huge gap. Another blind spot, geographical. My list is less French and English than I thought it would be. I thought that out of, in theory, 20 books, I would end up with something like 16 books originally written in English and in French. And that's not it. It turns out to be rather multilingual, but it's multilingual of very few countries. I have read nothing, well, not that I have read nothing, but I have nothing from Scandinavia. Nothing from Germany. I have read one book by Goethe, and I have read some other more contemporary German literature, but the canon of other languages, I have read very, very little of it. So I have nothing from Poland, Portuguese. I'm mixing countries with languages now, I realize that. But the literary tradition of Central Europe, let's say, I have read almost nothing of that. And even Southern Europe, I have read very little. As you'll see, it focuses mainly on English and French. These two together are more than half my list. And then there's a bit of other things, but there are geographical blind spots. And the third type of blind spot is in the genre-wise. I've said more than once on my channel that I'm a reader of nonfiction. I realize that I have read almost zero nonfiction written prior to the 20th century. So I have one book that is nonfiction on my list. The rest is purely fiction. And I think that's a blind spot, because for a long time, most of what was written, well, I don't know if it's most, but a lot of what was written was in fact nonfiction. All the histories that were written during the Roman times and the Greek times, all the philosophy that was written, the chronicles, the memoirs, that's a lot of things of nonfiction that was written historically, and that is still very relevant today, and I have not read it. So that's another blind spot. So basically blind spots everywhere. And that brings us to the last question, which is, what 20 books, or in my case 18, would you choose to represent your reading of Western literature? And for the first 3 books, I'm going to be inspired by Lindy from Lindy's Magpie Reads, by her version of this tag. Instead of choosing just 20 books, she just talked about her reading, how, as a reader, she encountered the Western canon or Western literature. And I'm going to start with the 3 books that in my life personally kind of represent how I grew up as a reader, how I became a reader, the reader that I am today. So the first book is Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. I read that when I was 10 years old. There was a cartoon on TV and I started to follow. The cartoon was following quite closely the chapters of the books. So I read 1 chapter a week and I kept going, and it started my love story with reading books, because in my mind, when I was 10 years old, this book was a book for adults. It's my mother who bought that book. She didn't buy it for me, she bought it for herself. So it's for me, it was discovering adult literature. Even though Anne of Green Gables is considered children literature, for me, when I was 10, it was an adult book, and I was very proud of reading that. And also, I'm Canadian, Anne of Green Gables is Canadian, so it's sort of doubly part of my Western literature canon. And then the next book that I read that made me feel very much like an adult was The Three Musketeers. On this side, there's room. So The Three Musketeers, it's a book that my brother read, and at the time I read basically everything my brother read, so I read The Three Musketeers when I was 13 years old. And once again, this was sort of another door that was opening on long books written 100 years ago. and books that were not necessarily written with a 13-year-old girl in mind. And yeah, this represents the adventure books, the historical novels, because I started to read a lot of historical novels after that. And it represents also 19th century French literature, even though there are other representatives on my list, but this was another open door. And then the third book that sort of made me graduate into the completely, totally adult readers were the Brothers Karamazov. I read that when I was 15. The English teacher had given us a list, and I made a video on that list. I'm going to leave a link to that in the description box below. And that list became, for me, my first meeting with the Western canon. Here was a list of 40 books by 40 different authors that somewhat represented literature. And if I remember correctly, there was nothing outside of the West. It was all European languages. There was no Chinese literature, Japanese literature, or literature from anywhere. Most books were written in English anyway. Books in French were excluded because that would have been the domain of the French teacher. So the English teacher did not want to step in the footpath of the French teacher. So the teacher had left out any French literature. So it was a list of 40 books, mainly of English literature, with some others. And among the others, there was the Brothers Karamazov. And for some reason, I thought that book sounded fascinating. And I decided to read it when I was 15 years old. I cannot say that I enjoyed it that much. I think I enjoyed the fact that I made it all the way to the end. At some point in the middle, it becomes a bit of a whodunit. There's somebody who is murdered, and we have to figure out who did it. So I think at the time I read it a lot for that mystery part. But after I had read that, I was confident that I could read anything. And after that, I started reading a whole bunch of stuff. So I think these three books represent how I grew up as a reader. Now I'm going to present in chronological order the other books that I have read. The other books that I decided to include in my top 18 of Western literature. And since I decided to exclude Gilgamesh, that leaves us with the Iliad as a beginning, and I'm also including the Odyssey. So two books by Homer. And the reason these two books deserve to be in the canon is that for me, when I read the Iliad less than a year ago, I want to say that, up to a year ago, I have read neither of these books. I read this one in December of 2021 because of BookTube. And I thought it was just the most extraordinary thing. I had the feeling I was seeing the birth of literature. This is the beginning of everything. Even though in theory Gilgamesh comes first, in the Western world, we sort of rediscovered Gilgamesh only in the 19th century. So it was not such an influential work. But this definitely was. It has never been out of print since it was written the first time. So for me, it opened so many doors. And of course, the Iliad remained so influential, and also the Odyssey, which is in a way the first adventure novel. I guess it's not a novel, it's epic poetry in both cases. But both of these books, they are at the beginning of everything. So they had to be included. Next, I would include Greek plays. I'm not including all of these because that would be cheating. If I had to choose one, I would choose Oedipus the King by Sophocles. I read that for the first time when I was in college, and I did not get what the fuss was about. I don't remember being bowled over by the book. At the time, when I was in college, I only liked novels. I didn't care for anything else that wasn't a novel, so I didn't care for plays. But since I read the Iliad last year, I wanted to read more about ancient Greece. And of course, that led me to plays. And of those that I have read, I think Oedipus the King is probably the most powerful and probably one of the most influential. Well, of course, there's the myth itself served for Freud and all his theories, so it had influence all the way to the 20th century. But it's not just that. I think in the storytelling, in the creation of characters, in the way the play is built, it has influenced a lot Western literature. So I include Oedipus the King as one of the great works of Western literature. Next, The Aeneid by Virgil. This one was written originally in Latin. That's another book that I've read just recently. I read it in June. I almost did not include this book. It's one of the books that is borderline. I include it because it would have felt weird not to include it. I have read no other books that was originally written in Latin. So if I did not include it in my Western canon, I would have another major gap. So in a way, so as to cover the gap as a representative of what I will read of Roman literature, I decided to include it. And then after that, this is where we have this massive jump in time. I have read nothing that was written in the millennia following this, and more than a millennia, because the next one I'm going to use is Shakespeare, because I could not include Shakespeare. And I'm going to choose just one work. I'm not cheating and trying to include 30-something plays and 37 plays and 160 sonnets in there. I'm just going to choose one to represent what I like of Shakespeare, and that one is going to be Othello. I have not seen a whole bunch of Shakespeare plays on stage. I have seen Richard III twice. I have seen Hamlet. I have seen a couple of comedies that I did not find funny, and Othello, and that is the one that moved me the most. I think Othello is one of the best Shakespeare play for the villain, Iago. That's a villain. I think it's one of the best to show how a mind can be manipulated, a bit of gaslighting before the word was invented, how a friendship can be abused, how a person can be deceived. And that is one. So Othello and Iago and Desdemona, they are some of the strongest characters, I think, in Shakespeare, and they remain an archetype of characters throughout Western literature. So I'm including Othello. Next, we have a novel considered to be the first novel in Western literature, and that is Don Quixote. And that's another book that I've read only relatively recently. I read that in January of 2021. Before that, I had never read it. Even though I knew about fighting windmills and things like that, I had never read the book. And I've read it, and it's very good. It's a tale of adventure by a main character who's a bit of a crackpot. His head is not completely there. He fights windmills because he thinks they're giants, and he rescues people who think he need rescuing, but they are thieves and they are prostitutes. And anyway, he does things that are not completely sane, but it's very, very entertaining. And his sidekick of Sancho Panza is just adorable. I think that's the best character in Don Quixote, particularly in the second book when Sancho Panza finally becomes governor of an island, and he shows how brilliant he is. It's a wonderful book. So yeah, that's the first novel on this list. Next, another little jump in time. We leave the Renaissance, well, not quite Renaissance with Don Quixote. That was the early 17th century, but we jump ahead by a couple of hundred years, and we land in England and Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Jane Austen is one of my favorite authors, and I think Pride and Prejudice deserves a place in the Western canon because with just this book alone, but also the work of Jane Austen in general, but Pride and Prejudice on its own started the entire genre of romance. Even though it did not start the next day after this was written, it took perhaps 100 years, but I think we can say that contemporary romance owes it all to Jane Austen, and for being the precursor to a wonderful genre that sells thousands and thousands of copies every day. I think Jane Austen totally deserves to be on the Western canon list, on any Western canon list, and particularly on mine because I've read all of her novels and some of her shorter writings, and for me personally, it's one of the authors I like the most. So she definitely deserves a place on this list. Next, we move to France. Of all the works I've talked about so far, none of them was written in French, and French is my first language. So we are now moving to France, and a journal by Émile Zola. I love Émile Zola. I think his fresco, his series of the Rougon-Macquart is one of the great works of literature. It's not something you have to read in order. I have not read it all yet. I've read 9 books and 8, 9, 10, I never remember. But I have not read them in order, and it doesn't matter at all. And I think Germinal is the best. I think it's the one that succeeds the most at what Zola is trying to do. So this is set in the north of France, in the coal mines, before the days of unions, before the days of health and safety, before everything. So just the industrial revolution at its worst. And Zola does a great work of depicting the vulnerability of the workers and how the machine, the capitalist and industrial machine, is crushing the men, the workers, their wives, their children, and everything. So I think it's the best of Zola portraying a little bit of French society in the 19th century. So this one is my choice for 19th century France. Well, not just that one. I have another book that was also representative of 19th century France, and that is The Flowers of Evil by Baudelaire. I wanted to have a bit of poetry on my list. Now, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey are epic poems, but this is not an epic poem. It's just poetry for the sake of poetry. It's not trying to be an epic of any sort. And I think this is one of the best collection of poetries ever written. I don't know how it translates in English. That's the thing. It's very hard to tell. But in French, I think it's the most extraordinary that exists. Not that I have read a million. Again, I'm choosing among a very narrow sample. But I think Baudelaire, also the author himself, can be representative of a particular time period of what perhaps became the ancestor of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. In this case, it was sex, drugs, and poetry. And he was not alone in there. You can think of Rimbaud, Verlaine, de Nerval, all the poets of that time. They all had serious personal issues. But yeah, it's a representative of that time. So that's why I placed them on my Western canon. Next, we move to Russia. I've already mentioned The Brothers Karamazov as one of the first works of literature that I read, and I think it sort of set my compass towards Russia. I have read a little bit, not a lot again. Compared to the people who have read them all, I have not read a lot, but compared to the people who have read nothing, I've read quite a bit. So I have read a few Russian literature books, and I thought some of them deserve to be on this list. And I've chosen, well, it's this one that I have that is partly in Russian. Once upon a time, I could somewhat decipher the left page, the original. I could decipher it and understand, with the help of the translation, I could understand what was going on. So this is 3 of Gogol's short stories. And I chose them because short stories is another genre that is very important to Western literature, so I wanted a representative. But these particular stories, the nose, the overcoat, and that would be Diary of a Madman. I'm not sure what the English title would be, but they all have a bit of what today we would call magic realism. I think without Gogol, we wouldn't have Borges. We wouldn't have another writer, French writer that I like a lot is Marcel Aimé, who wrote The Man Who Could Walk Through Walls. I think without Gogol, we wouldn't have these 20th century writers who included a lot of magical elements in what otherwise would have been realistic writing. And I think the short story also sort of reached its apex at the end of the 19th century and perhaps early 20th century. And Gogol is a good representative of that particular part of literature. Next, one that could not be there, War and Peace. It has to be on the list. After The Brothers Karamazov, not immediately after, but after having read The Brothers Karamazov, I felt I could read anything, and yet I was somewhat intimidated by this. But one summer, when I was, if I remember correctly, 18 years old, I decided that I would read War and Peace, and I did. And I loved it. So I did not read this copy. This copy I've had for a couple of years. I read a copy in French from the library, and then I bought my own copy because I liked it so much and I wanted to go back to it. So it's a book I've read just once, as opposed to some other books on this list that I've read more than once, like Pride and Prejudice, The Three Musketeers, Anne of Green Gables, The Brothers Karamazov. I've read that more than once. But this one I've read just once, cover to cover, but some scenes, I go back to them all the time. Natasha's First Ball, in particular, it's one of my favorite. So this, for the scope of the work, I think deserves to be on any list of Western literature canon, Western canon. If you think about it, nowadays, whenever some author writes an epic novel, a historical novel of very large proportion, they will say it's a modern War and Peace. It has become the standard for any work of historical fiction, for any work of a broad scope. So that's why I think this list would be completely incomplete without it. And the last book from the 19th century came at the very end of the 19th century. It's another French book. It is Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand, and that's a play. And I realized that I've included quite a few plays, and yet I'm not much of a play reader. I prefer to read novels. But so the Cyrano de Bergerac, I include it because the character is just so extraordinary. And I guess also this sort of became the apex of theater. And I think shortly after Cyrano de Bergerac was written, theater started to die a little bit because cinema was invented. Of course, cinema did not completely displace theater, but I think in the heart of ordinary people, cinema is much more accessible than plays are. And also what is extraordinary about this play, that there's the character, of course, but there's also the fact that it was written in 3 weeks. The author had not written anything for a long time, anything worthy, and then suddenly he had this commission to write this play, and he was writing it on the go, and it's written in verse. That's another thing that makes it extraordinary, and I think in a way it goes back to Greek theater, because as the crowd, the members of the crowd know what's going on, but the characters on the scene don't necessarily know what's going on. Roxane, she doesn't know what's going on, and she gets the revelation only at the end. But as viewers, we knew what happened, so we have information that the main character does not. And it's a bit like in Oedipus the King, because that was a myth everybody knew about. So when Oedipus claims that he will be an impartial arbiter in the investigation of who killed the previous king, he says, "I have nothing to do with that because that was before my time." The crowd knows that no, that's not the case. So I think there's a bit of a link between this play and other plays that came before. And it's one of my favorites in literature, and this character of Cyrano de Bergerac is just the most extraordinary. And once again, I don't know how well it translates in English. As I said, this was written in verse, so I don't know how well it translates, but I'm sure that there's a way of making something extraordinary out of it. And that brings us to the last 3 books, and the 3 were written in the 20th century. So first, the first nonfiction and the only nonfiction on my list, If This Is a Man by Primo Levi. This is his first-hand account of what happened in Auschwitz. He was an Italian Jew. He was taken in 1943 and brought to the camps and survived to tell the tale, even though his life was never the same afterwards. He was, of course, completely scarred by the events and by the sheer scale of the horror that he witnessed. And this is one of the most moving books I've ever read. I've never had the courage to reread it. I read it once, and it's the sort of book that is sort of imprinted on your memory. It's seared in your mind, and it's very hard to forget. So this definitely belongs in the Western canon. And as I said, I wish I had read more of nonfiction that is older than the 20th century, but I have read almost nothing. So this book will have to stand for all of nonfiction ever written. Another play, this one, I didn't know if I should include it or not. That's the last book that I included in my list, and I think it is benefiting from the fact that I read it only a few weeks ago. It is a one-woman play, La Sagouine, and it is written in dialect, and I think that's the reason why I decided to include it. I said that I defined Western literature by the language, but the language in here, it's French. There's no denying that it's French, because if you speak Italian, if you speak Micmac, if you speak any other language, you will not understand this. You need to speak French to understand this. But it's not standard French. It's a different sort of French. So I think it is one step that brings literature in Western literature in a bit of a different direction. It is breaking the codes, because Western literature is written mostly. They're at the origin, the first two books that I chose, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were probably written to be sung, written to be told. They were not, I say written to be sung, they were composed to be sung, and they were put in writing only much later. So the literature, the tradition that we have is one of writing, is one that's sort of fixed on the paper and that doesn't move a lot. And in the case of French, the rules of French were fixed very much in the 17th century and hasn't moved much since. But the effect is that what we say does not always match what we write. And in this book, the author decided to match what was written with what we say. And the character who speaks, there's just one character in the entire play, and it's a woman who has absolutely no education. So once again, it is giving to people who would normally not feature much in Western literature, who normally would not be heard much in Western literature, and it's giving this ordinary people, not even ordinary, a bit under ordinary, extraordinary in the sense that not many people have that sort of life. Underprivileged, I guess, of our Western society, and they are put at the forefront. So I think it is a good representative of regional literature among the Western canon. And the last book that I include is Beloved by Toni Morrison. And I think this book represents classics of the future, because it's not a very old book. It's less than 50 years old. And La Sagouine 2, by the way, it's not quite 50 years old. It was published in 1971. And this one, I think, is from 1984. I could check. 1987. So it's basically, it's 35 years old. It's barely 35 years old. So it's very, very young to be on a list of canon works. But I think it's going to remain part of the canon, as opposed to a lot of other works that are praised today, and I'm sure will be forgotten in a very few years. If you want names, I'm going to give you the name of the French writer Michel Houellebecq. I'm willing to bet that in 50 years nobody will read him. Nobody will care. But Toni Morrison, people will care. It's powerful storytelling. Again, it's giving an occasion. It's giving. I just have the French expression in my head. That's why I'm struggling so much. Donner la parole, giving the speech. It's giving a chance to ordinary people to speak. So in this case, it's the point of view of slaves and former slaves, and it's a storytelling that is extremely powerful. And I think it also represents the future of Western literature, because it's not written in Europe. So of all these books of Western literature, only two I chose were not from Europe, and it's the last two that I chose. They are the two most recent. So I think at least a part of the future of Western literature will not be in Europe. It will be in North America, it will be in Australia, it might be in India, in Africa, it may be in many places except Europe. So I think this will be my representative of classics of the future. So that is my list of 18 books, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, and it's a very, very long video, but I don't think I could have made it shorter if I could have just blurted the books, but I wanted to talk about them a little bit. So I counted a little bit. Let's have fun with numbers. So of this list, 5 were originally written in French, 4 originally written in English, 3 originally written in ancient Greek or Russian, 1 in Latin, 1 in Spanish, and 1 in Italian. I didn't count the genres, but I think there were 4 plays. So yes, there were 4 plays: La Sagouine, Cyrano, Othello, and Oedipus. So that's 4 plays, 2 works of epic poetry, and 1 work of regular poetry, and the rest were novels. No, 1 nonfiction, and the rest were novels. In a way, I think it's representative of Western literature because in the last 200 years, at least, the novel has been king. We don't write a lot of things that are not novels. And I wanted to mention that of these 18 books, 4 of them I had not read a year ago. So if I had made that video 1 year ago, 4 of these books would not have been on the list. Well, actually 5 of these books would not have been on the list. I read Oedipus the King in college, but I didn't care for it then, and I reread it this summer and I thought, wow. So 5 of the books would not have been on the list. And that makes me wonder what would be on the list if I was to do the same video, not the same video, but the same tag in a year from now. I am currently reading Middlemarch for the first time. I'm about halfway through. So far, I'm not sure it deserves a place on my personal list because I haven't finished it yet, and it's not a book that I have spent a lot of time with. Some books that I thought of including but did not include. There was Jane Eyre in there that I read for the first time this summer. And the reason I decided not to include it in the list is that I think I need to read more books by Charlotte Bronte to solidify the place of that book in my mind. I really liked it. Is it canon yet? Not for me, because it's too recent to read. Same thing for House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. I read this for the first time this spring. I need to spend more time with the author to really feel that she is part of my personal canon. And Middlemarch, if I finish it, it will take a little time before I consider it part of my personal canon, I guess. And first, I need to finish it because it's not done yet. I still have 350 pages to go. And after I had made my list and realized some of the blind spots, I went to the bookstore because I always go to the bookstore, and I found this. So I decided to buy it because there's such a gap in my reading of medieval literature that I have to do something about it. It bothers me now. Now that I've noticed, it's bothering me. So I'm going to read this at some point, not right now, but I'm going to read this. So maybe 1 year from now, this list would be different because I'm going to keep reading other ancient Greek works. I'm going to keep reading ancient Roman works. I'm going to try to read some medieval literature. I'm going to keep exploring the canon of Western literature and perhaps Eastern too. At the moment, I would not be able to do a canon of Eastern literature. I wouldn't have 20 books to put on that list. But who knows what I would be able to do next year. So, okay, and now I'm going to tag some people. It's just an invitation. You don't have to if you don't want to. I'm going to tag Tori from Good Strong Words and Jennifer Brooks because they are hosts with David Wiley of Ancients-a-thon. So I'm sure they have read a lot of books that belong to the canon. I'm going to tag Sandy at Miss Reads a Lot because she's reading the 101 books you must read before you die. She's reading on that list. There must be quite a few books part of the Western canon in there. I'm going to tag Elizabeth at A Literary Princess. She is studying literature at university. She certainly has something to say on the subject. And I'm going to tag Courtney Ferriter. She hasn't done any videos lately, but perhaps she just needs a little nudge. I'm sure she would have a lot of interesting things to say about this. So these are the people I tag. And if you want to do the tag, consider yourself tagged. Thank you everyone for watching. I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine!